Hello everyone, welcome to another day of notes. Mr. Smith here, your 8th grade U.S. history teacher here at Emmadon Middle School, and today we'll be covering Chapter 1, Section 2, Part 1. Our notes today have quite a bit of information, but I tried to break it down into 2 days for you guys, so that way you're not overwhelmed with lots and lots and lots of information and trying to keep all this stuff straight. Our notes today are going to cover topics from what is a culture, and certain Native American groups and the cultures that they had living in North America. So let's get started. All right, again, for the sake of time, I am not going to ask you to go and watch CNN Student News because you're probably watching this video because you are either a student that missed a day, and so I'm not going to ask you to go out of your way and go find it and go Google search it, or you're a student reviewing for a test or a quiz, and I'm not going to ask you to rewatch all those CNN Student Newses because as much as they are important about letting us know current events and what's going on in the world around us, I am not going to quiz you directly over these CNN Student News topics. All right, so as a class, we watch CNN Student News. You don't have to. Then we're going to complete about 20 minutes worth of notes. These notes are going to be beneficial because they're going to help you understand what a culture is and different Native American cultures. Then we moved on to a mapping activity that I'll modify for you in a little bit. And then we worked on a paragraph response, class culture right. So what's the difference between a class culture paragraph right and a race response? A race response, you are citing evidence from a source of some kind, whether it's a book, a interview, could be an image that you looked at. You are citing evidence and then explaining what that evidence is. This class culture paragraph right is not a race response. So you are not going to have to cite evidence. You are going to give your own personal opinion. So there's a slight difference in what we're calling a race response versus a paragraph right. All right, so in our notes today, we're going to try to answer these 3 questions. We're going to look at how did other Native American groups live in the Americas? What was the culture of these other Native American groups in their regions or where they lived geographically? And how does a culture define a civilization and or a society? So that last question, number 3, is what we're going to be looking at first. How does a culture define what a civilization or a society is? And by the end of class, you should be able to identify and explain the culture or what culture is and the culture and location of Native American groups that lived in North America. All right, so on your tree branch, to the very left, first branch, you'll see, or excuse me, on your tree map, the left side, your first tree branch, there we go, you're going to see your tree branch labeled first cultures. Anything in color, so anything in yellow, needs to be written in that first tree branch, starting with culture, way of life. All right, so we're moving away from those 3 major civilizations that we talked about yesterday, the Aztec, the Maya, and the Inca. What we're going to be talking about today is sort of similar, and that we're talking about different cultures of other Native American groups. We hinted at it yesterday, but didn't really define culture and talk really in depth about the different cultures of those groups. We're going to talk more in depth about other Native American groups living in North America and what their culture was. And how we define culture in our 8th grade U.S. history class is it's a way of life. So your culture is made up of your attitudes, your belief systems in a certain civilization, the language of that civilization, the customs they have, the rituals, the faith and religion, the food that those individuals are eating, the art and drama that people are creating, the music that people are crafting. That's going to impact a person's way of life or how they live their life. And so when we talk about culture groups, these culture groups of Native Americans is going to be different because they're going to live in different locations. They're going to have different beliefs about the drama or the music that they're listening to. They're going to have different beliefs on the customs. Their own personal religious beliefs are going to be different. So these cultures are going to be different. Some may be similar, but many times it's going to be very different based on the region or the geography of where these Native Americans are going to be living. And so the food that they're eating will be different. The clothing that they have is going to be different. So pay close attention to the text, but also in the pictures in these upcoming slides. Because again, these Native Americans are going to move or live in different regions from southern Alaska, or just basically Alaska, all the way down into the Southwest, where Southern California, Arizona are all going to be located. So pay close attention to how these Native Americans live differently and have different cultures or a different way of life. Disclaimer, these Native Americans are going to use irrigation, or most of these Native Americans are going to use irrigation. So there is one similarity in that these Native Americans are not always going to be wanderers or nomads. They are going to have specific set of civilizations where they have structured government, structured religion, and that's going to be due to irrigation. All right, so ways of life. In your second column of your tree branch, you should be writing down anything that's in yellow in that branch. So scientists and archaeologists and historians categorize Native Americans into culture groups. So if you see the map on the left of this note slide, it should look very similar to the map on the last slide. If you are a historian, if you are a sociologist, or you're a psychologist, you would look at a map and say, man, these individuals live in culture areas. So a culture area is where Native Americans or individuals have a very similar way of life. So if you look on these maps where those gray lines are, they're blocking off culture areas where Native Americans living in those areas have very similar cultures or very similar way of life. If you are a map maker, you are going to say that these Native Americans live in a similar region. So the environment is going to be similar to other Native Americans living in that group. For us, I'm going to use probably interchangeably culture areas and region. All it means is that Native Americans living in that area either have the same environment that they're living in, or they have the same type of way of life that they are living in. Regardless of whether it's a culture area that I'm talking about or the region, many of these Native Americans across all the different regions or different culture areas of North America, many of the times the women were the one that stayed home and collected roots and berries, while the men went out and hunted and fished. Women also were responsible for the farming, so lots of times women had larger roles in government and also played a larger role in making decisions, especially for the household, because the husband was off lots of time trying to find meat for the family to have, along with the food that the females in the civilization or society were growing near their homes. Trade was also a common practice among these Native American groups, so another similarity, lots of Native Americans traded things like shells or other natural resources as their form of currency, or basically their form of money. So whether or not you know it, we in the United States, we base our money off of gold and silver. The reason for that is it's a precious gem that's valuable to us. These Native Americans weren't necessarily out mining for gold, looking for gold and silver, so their natural resources were things like shells and different things like that. So that was their currency, or the way that they basically paid for different goods that they traded with one another. Many of these Native American groups in all of the culture areas or all of the region of North America, many of them believed that there were spirits living in the nature around them, and that the land was not theirs, but it was the community's land. So you couldn't just say, this land is my land, you can't have it. It was the community's land. You basically grew what you needed for the community, and it was the community's land. There was no ownership of the land. That's not an idea that starts with Native Americans. That starts with Europeans, and that's a huge difference and going to cause a lot of problems when Europeans come into contact or meeting with Native American groups that say the land is everyone's land, and Europeans say, no, this is going to be my land, not yours. But we'll get to that later. All right, so in your third branch of your tree map, you should see far north Native Americans. Again, just like yesterday with the three major civilizations, I will give you a snapshot of these Native Americans and the lives that they lived, but it is by no means all-inclusive of every single aspect of Native American life. So keeping that in mind, know that your notes are not going to cover every single detail of culture and the ways that these Native Americans lived. It's just enough to help you know that there were differences in how these Native Americans live. So the far north. Lots of times the far north, you might think of these Native Americans as individuals who lived in igloos. You might think of them as Eskimos. As historians, we are going to not use that language because that encompasses them into different stereotypes that we are not going to partake in. So what you need to know is that these Native Americans have different names. It might be similar to what you think of, but it is not Eskimo. They are not the Eskimo people. That's not a thing. So forget Eskimos. Just know that these Native Americans are living in the far north in a very harsh climate where lots of times there was ice and snow all year round. They hunted things like whales, seals, walruses, fish, and caribou. And their clothing, again, a part of their culture, the way that they lived, shows the type of animals that they killed because they used the caribou fur as their coats or their cloaks, and they used that fur to protect them from those harsh winters and those harsh climates where there was snow and ice nearly every single day of the year surrounding them. So they needed to protect themselves. Another way that makes these culture or the culture of the Native Americans in the far north different is that they used kayaks or small boats made from skins. And this means of transportation is very different from, say, the Plains Indians, because these kayaks are going to be used to transport these Native Americans to help them go hunt for whales, hunt for seals, hunt for walrus blubber, so that they can use it for their candles and things like that, which makes this very specific and unique to these far north Native American tribes. Some Native American names of people or tribes that lived in this region in this harsh winter climate are the Inupiat or the Inuit, the Yupik, and the Alouette. All lived in these harsh climates. They all lived in a housing home called an igloo, which you've probably tried to make every single winter, where basically it's large chunks of ice to protect these Native Americans from this harsh, cold climate. Moving a little bit further down south, you have a group called the Northwest Native Americans. These Native Americans lived in an area stretching from southern Alaska to northern California. Take notice of how their culture is slightly different in the types of food that they're eating. So instead of looking for walruses and whales, these Native Americans are hunting deer, bears, they're eating roots and also berries. They did also use boats of different kinds in order to try to hunt wildlife like fish and different things like that. So again, even though they're in different regions or cultural areas, they did have similar diets in that they were both eating animals from the ocean and different things like that. Many of these Native Americans in the Northwest region also had something very specific to them called a potlatch. And if you've ever read Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits have their parties, this is basically what would happen in those Lord of the Rings books and also in Native American culture. There'd be a ceremony where there'd be someone celebrating, and that host, the one celebrating, would actually give gifts to their guests. So instead of receiving it, like at a birthday party, they would give their gifts to the guests that came to this potlatch or this celebration. Another difference that makes the Northwest Native Americans very unique is their types of housing. So instead of like the far north Native Americans that lived in igloos or in those ice houses to protect them from the harsh winters, this area or this region, the Northwest, is very densely wooded. And so what Native Americans did is they created long houses, which were basically made of these long cedar planks that they cut down from the trees, and they made them into structured houses. Also, many times these Northwest Native Americans, they would have something called totem poles, as you can see in this picture, outside of their houses. And these totem poles were thought to house spirits. And as you left the house, the spirit animal in the totem pole would follow you and protect you to make sure that wherever you went and then came back to the house, you were protected by that spirit animal. So again, an aspect of the religion from these Northwest Native Americans in or next to a part of their culture from their housing from these longhouses and these totem poles. So very distinct different cultures from these Native Americans and regions that are close to each other, but very distinctly different and unique to their own cultural areas or their own regions. All right, the mapping activity, I'm going to say come find me again at the end of class, or when you come back to class, and I will help you locate these specific regions. I'm not going to make you do this on your own because I don't want you to not get it correct 100%. So come find me and I will gladly help you at lunch, or we can work through it in the morning before class starts. Class culture. Here is what you need to do for your paragraph right. You need to answer the following questions. What is a culture? How does our classroom have a culture? And how do you think the culture of this classroom will affect the school year? So again, it's not a race response. I'm not asking you to restate and answer the questions and then cite and explain. What I am asking you to do is restate and answer these questions, but using your own opinion. So tell me what you think is a culture. You can use the same definition that we gave, or you can come up with your own definition that you want. How does our classroom have a culture? So think back to our class. Think about who's in that class. What might be the culture of our class? What are some expectations that are expected of us in that class? What are the beliefs of our class? What does Mr. Smith want us to be following in the classroom? What does he expect from me as a student in that classroom? Think about your parents. What are they expecting? Maybe you live with your uncle, your auntie, or a guardian. What are they expecting as a student from you in that classroom? And then lastly, how do you think your behavior or your impact in our classroom culture is going to affect this school year? So what happens if you follow the expectations? Where is our classroom going to go? How are students going to succeed? And then on the flip, what would happen if classroom expectations weren't met? How would that affect how our class would run for this entire school year? Take a few moments, write down this in a short paragraph, bring it to class, and I will gladly look at it. Until next time, Mr. Smith out.